Today I'm analyzing the metagame of the Paradox Rift format for the Pokemon TCG. This is going to be a little more of a laid-back kind of slideshow video, but if you're interested in the competitive Pokemon TCG and analyzing the metagame, I think this will be a very valuable video for you. And please leave it in the comments down below what you like, dislike about this video, anything that you felt could have been left out, and anything that I didn't talk about that you would like me to talk about in a future video like this. So I want to start with Toronto. This was the last tournament prior to Paradox Rift being legal for play. The previous North American regional, which was Sacramento, prior to Toronto, was dominated by Lugia. Lugia got first, fourth, sixth, and eighth place at Sacramento. And between Sacramento and Toronto was the Lille regionals in Europe, and that was won by Fusion Mew. Now, a lot of times, European regionals won't affect what people play at North American regionals, and it also depends on the results, right? So, like, Fusion Mew didn't really have much of an effect on Toronto. Mew was not one of the most popular decks day one, and its highest placement day two was 48th. So sometimes for North American events, it's like the European events and Australian events didn't even happen. With something like Fusion Mew winning, that didn't really influence the North American meta. But if a brand new deck came out and won the European regional in Lille, then typically those kinds of things do have an effect on North America. That's at least what I've taken from this data and watching tournament data for years and years. It seems like if something novel comes out at a foreign regional, then the North American meta accounts for it. But if an already known deck that isn't performing well in North America performs well over in Europe, a lot of times it's just kind of shrugged off as a fluke or a different metagame over there, and North American players just go on with their day. So at Toronto, the six most represented decks from day one, Lost Zone, Charizard, Lugia, Chien-Pao, Gardevoir, and Maridon, all made it into the top eight. And Maridon, which was the sixth most popular deck in day one and day two, according to the stream deck analysis, that won the event. So I also want to note that we do not have full day one meta information, because on the Pokemon streams, they only show us the top six decks, like you see here on the top left of the screen. And Arcanine Labs hasn't revealed or released full meta analysis since like 2021 or I think 2021 was the last time they revealed full meta analysis, maybe early in the 2022 season. So yeah, we only have the day one information that they show us on the stream, like you see here, but Limitless does have the full day two meta, as you see in the pie chart down there. So we can always analyze the full day two meta, can't always analyze the full day one meta. So with Toronto, I want to talk a lot about Maridon and its success. Now, note I did say we'll talk about the Paradox Rift format, but this still matters. This was the last tournament right before Paradox Rift. On paper, Maridon had a lot of bad matchups in the field, including Lost Zone Box, which was the most popular deck day one, Charizard, which was the second most popular deck day one, Gardevoir. Remember, at this time, Maridon did not have Iron Hands. Gardevoir was the fifth most popular, and also, on paper, a bad matchup to Mew, which was the Lille Regionals winner. Maridon had a good matchup against Lugia, which was still a comfort pick, fine in the meta, and it won the most recent North American regionals in Sacramento. And Maridon also has a good matchup against Chien-Pao, which was gaining popularity and esteem. Ultimately, Maridon, a deck with, for all intents and purposes, by my analysis, had a middling matchup spread, won the event. So what can we take from this? Those are kind of the facts. Now, what can we actually deduce from this? It could mean that luck is a huge factor. It could mean that a functioning strong deck piloted well can win an event, even with an unimpressive matchup spread. It could also mean that metagaming doesn't matter as much when we have such large and diverse fields with 1,500, even now 2,000 players at regionals. I think at the end of the day, it ends up being a combination of those things, but we're going to analyze this deeper on the next slide. The question I asked myself is what made Maridon different from the other top decks? assuming that it wasn't all just luck and it doesn't matter what deck you play, right? So we have Lost Zone Box, Charizard, Lugia, Chien-Pao, Gardevoir, Maridon here, all as the top 6 decks from day 1. Maridon was also the 6th most popular in day 2. Why did Maridon win and not these other decks? There were good players playing all of the decks. So here are the things that I've kind of gathered from my analysis. Lost Zone Box and Gardevoir have 2 things in common. They are more difficult to play, and they are prone to ties due to single prize strategies and long turns with many actions. Not only does this mean pilots on these decks could lose match points to ties, but they need to be more precise over the course of the tournament for their deck to function optimally, compared to decks with less micro decisions, less complicated lines of play, and more reliable setups. I want to take special note of my wording here saying that these decks need more precise play, or the pilots have to be more precise with these decks, which some people say, well, you have to be good to play this deck, or if you're not as good, maybe play that deck because the decisions don't matter as much. Other players might word it as, misplays are punished by these decks and often go unpunished by other decks. I think the best way to say it is that the deck needs precise play, or that the deck doesn't need as precise play. So the level of how precise your play needs to be on that day for that deck to reach its full power cap, because there's really no such thing as a bad player or a good player. It's how that player plays on that day with that deck. And so that's why I use that wording of how precise you need to be for the deck to function and perform as expected. So long story short, Lost Zone Box and Gardevoir, you have to be very, very precise for those decks to work as intended. The next bullet point, Charizard, Lugia, and Chien-Pao, while they don't necessarily need as precise play to perform their best, are oriented around a small combo in the early turns. Zard and Pal involve rare candy, while Lugia needs Lugia V turn 1 and 2 Archeops in discard by turn 2. Maridon doesn't have these rigid benchmarks, lengthy games, or high amount of decisions per turn, yet it's still competing up here and popular with these other decks. So I found reasons to discount every one of these decks on the top 6 outside of Maridon. Now, Maridon, of course, can be discounted for its poor matchups, but we've already acknowledged that. So my theory here is that Lost Zone Box and Gardevoir lose match points to ties, and they lose games due to needing very precise play because of their amount of micro decisions, their complicated lines of plays to decipher, and less reliable setups. Whereas Charizard, Lugia, and Chien-Pao don't have those, what I just mentioned for Lost Zone and Gardevoir, but what they do have is a small combo that has a very, no room for error. As I worded it, Maridon doesn't have rigid benchmarks like these other decks do. Charizard Pidgeot needs to establish multiple stage 2s. Lugia needs to establish multiple stage 2s via having a Lugia V turn 1 and then getting 2 Archeops into the discard turn 2, a very rigid benchmark. Chien-Pao, possibly the least rigid benchmark of the 3 that I'm mentioning, still needs to get 1 stage 2 in play, but then also needs to find the water energies, the correct Pokemon, get the correct Pokemon into the active, getting the stage 1 with the stage 2 down with Chien-Pao, doesn't guarantee that the game is going to go well from here on out the same way that Lugia and Charizard do. So they all have their issues with these small combos and rigid benchmarks that I mentioned, while Lost Zone Box and Gardevoir have lengthy games and high amount of decisions per turn. So now we'll go on to look at the day 2 meta shares leading up to Toronto. So again, these are not Paradox Rift format legal events. For Pittsburgh, 151 was not yet legal, and then starting at Peoria, 151 became legal. And this is important, even though today we're talking about Paradox Rift, because the findings with Maridon that I'm talking about and on Lost Box and Gardevoir there, that's not really format specific. And also that when we're looking for trends in the meta, we don't just look at the last tournament. That doesn't show us a trend. We want to look at as much data as possible to see where these trends are happening. So what can we deduce from this data? Lost Zone Box won both Pittsburgh and Peoria, and we can see that its meta shares are pretty high for Pittsburgh, and then they drop down for Peoria. The following North American tournament, Sacramento, after Pittsburgh and Peoria, had the largest day 2 percentage of Lost Zone Box from this data set. So it won Pittsburgh. Okay, maybe that's a fluke. Almost the same deck. Lost Zone Kyogre again wins Peoria. That's the very next North American regional. Players see, okay, Lost Zone Box Kyogre might be the absolute best way to try to win an event. And then at Sacramento, we see a lot of good players take it to day 2, and it had the highest day 2 percentage, not only of Lost Box, but of any deck in this data set between Pittsburgh and Toronto. At Sacramento, where Lost Zone Box was the largest percentage of deck in day 2, Lugia V-Star placed 1st, 4th, 6th, and 8th, and Arceus V-Star placed 2nd and 9th. Both of these decks have good matchups against Lost Zone Box. So the players who brought Lugia and Arceus made a really good meta call there, seeing that a lot of players were going to hop onto the Lost Zone Box train. There was a huge spike in Charizard decks in Peoria, which followed the Curitiba regionals, which is not shown in the data, was smaller foreign regionals, where William Azevedo won with his new Arvinzard build. That's exactly what I was talking about earlier, saying that oftentimes for foreign regionals, North America doesn't reflect what happened at the foreign regionals unless it was something novel. And William won with a new build of Charizard, which was novel, and a lot of players took this for Sacramento. Note that across between Pittsburgh and Toronto, Gardevoir didn't really have drastic changes in day 2 meta share. Gardevoir is the green with the circle dots. It goes from just under 10 to just under 15 to just over 10 to 12.5 to 12.5. Very similar day 2 meta shares across the board. Mew VMAX and Lugia, which are both pre-existing strong archetypes, both had a gradual decrease in day 2 spots as the format matured. So we see Mew VMAX on the data, which is the dashed thick yellow line, starting in Pittsburgh at almost 15% and having a decline across the way, ending in Toronto at just over 5%. Lugia, the red line with dots, starting in Pittsburgh at over 15%, about 17 or 18% in Pittsburgh, going all the way down to under 10 in Peoria, even lower in Sacramento, even lower in Lille, which was a foreign regional, and then popping back up for Toronto. On to the LAIC deck usage for day 1. This was the first major event with Paradox Rift legal. And they showed the top 6 decks here again, with Gardevoir being almost 18% of the day 1 field, Charizard just under it at 16, and then a pretty big drop off, and then the next few decks were pretty similar to each other. Chi and Pal with almost 10%, Tina with almost 10, Roaring Moon with 9, and Maridon with 8%. So what I want to look at here is the conversion rates from day 1 to day 2, with the standings on the right being from Limitless TCG, showing how many of each archetype were in day 2, and using the information that we have from the TPCI stream, the data provided by Arcanine Labs on the left. So Gardevoir, we know it was 17.8% of the day 1 meta, with 224 people playing Gardevoir EX, and 32 of those players made it into day 2 for a conversion rate of 14%. And going from 1,258 players day 1 to roughly 10% of that in day 2, the average conversion rate, or the good conversion rate, would be 10%, meaning that the deck converted as expected with the amount of players in the field from day 1 to day 2. So anything over 10% is considered to be significantly good. And then anything under 10%, I'd say anything 5% and below is deemed to be poor. And then anything between 5 to 10% is below average to average. So Gardevoir, Giratina, Mew, and Lost Zone Box all had above average conversions into day 2. Now, although Mew and Lost Zone are not shown, we don't know exactly how many of those decks were played in day 1. We know that it was 7.9% or lower of day 1, since they showed Maridon at 0%. So we know that Mew and Lost Zone Box had somewhere under 101 players on each of those decks. So we can estimate that they had at least a 12% conversion rate for Mew. Lost Zone Box had at least a 10% conversion rate, maybe most likely better for both of these. And then Lugia had at least a 7% conversion rate using the same deduction there. Charizard, Chien-Pao, and Maridon had slightly below average conversions, but still had good showings in day 2. Roaring Moon had the worst conversion out of the most played decks. So, at LAIC, Rapid Strike Urshifu had even to favorable matchups against 5 out of 6 of the most popular decks in day 1 and day 2. And we see Rapid Strike Urshifu got 10th place at LAIC. So Rapid Strike Urshifu kind of went under the radar following LAIC as a good play, as well as Mew VMAX. I actually had people commenting on my tier list prior to LAIC saying, like, meta manipulation, doesn't know what he's talking about, blah, 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 because I said that Mew VMAX was really, really good. And in my eyes, there's very, very little difference between top 16 and top 8 at such a very large event. So, in my opinion, Mew VMAX or Inteleon Urshifu had just as good of a chance at making top 8 and winning the event as some of these other decks did. Maridon won again, this time with Iron Hands EX, which turned several bad matchups into even or favorable. And my analysis on Maridon from Toronto still rings true. It doesn't have rigid benchmarks, lengthy games, or high amount of decisions per turn. It also doesn't have as polarizing matchups as something like Inteleon Urshifu, which really, really loses hard to Mew VMAX, and also loses hard to Snorlax Stall, or like Snorlax Stall, which loses really, really hard to Giratina Lost Zone. Now let's analyze the Paradox Rift data, and I will help you along here because this is a whole mess of lines and dots, but I have arrows, and also I have changed the shapes and colors of some of the data, so hopefully that will help as we go along. So Lost Zone Box saw an immediate decrease in play with the release of Paradox Rift. The leftmost data point here is Toronto on 10/28. That was the last North American event prior to Paradox Rift. And then LAIC, Gdansk, Stuttgart, and San Antonio are all Paradox Rift. So I show Toronto as a reference point to where things were pre-Paradox Rift. And we can see that Lost Zone Box, the blue dotted line, was almost at 20% day 2 meta share at Toronto, dropped all the way down to about 6 or 7% at LAIC. Then in Gdansk day 2, dropped even lower. Stuttgart came back up a little bit, and San Antonio, even after winning Stuttgart, still hasn't recovered fully. This is partially because of the release of Iron Hands EX and the hype of Iron Hands EX, also partially because of Jirachi. Also partially because of other good decks in the meta, like Entei v Iron Valiant and Rapid Strike Urshifu, which are poor matchups for Lost Zone, and decks like Chien-Pao and Maridon, which used to be some of Lost Zone Box's best matchups, now becoming even to even maybe unfavorable due to Iron Hands EX. Now let's highlight Gardevoir. Gardevoir's popularity and success has been incredibly volatile, going from over 20% of day 2 in LAIC to less than 10% of day 2 in Gdansk, back to 15% in Stuttgart, and then under 10% again in San Antonio. It's likely the players got scared off of Guardy after the Maridon win and Entei Valiant second place in LAIC. After winning LAIC with its lowest day 2 popularity yet, Maridon skyrocketed to the second most popular deck in day 2 of Gdansk. It saw a huge drop-off after, likely due to the increased popularity and viability of Charizard and Stall. Mew VMAX ended the 1-5-1 format poorly in Toronto, and eventually returned to good form in Gdansk, where it was the most popular deck in day 2. 6 out of 8 of LAIC's top 8 were favorable matchups for Mew, as well as Rapid Strike Urshifu being 10th place and a good play for upcoming events, making Mew VMAX even better, which we saw its huge spike in day 2 success at Gdansk. Charizard rivaled Guardy's LAIC showing at San Antonio, taking up over 20% of the day 2 field. In my opinion, Robin Schultz trailblazed the new Charizard Pidgeot build at Gdansk, which was built to have a favored matchup into Guardy, Maridon, Mew, and Lost Zone Box, also playing 5 path outs for one of its former worst matchups, Tina. So what comes next? What can we actually do with this data? Spiritomb may become more commonplace in decks since it can hurt Charizard's turn 1 as well as Mew VMAX, and it also affects Lugia, but that will likely not be a driving factor. TMD Evolution is scary for Pidgeot Zard, and we may see more Zards play Tool Jammer. Rapid Strike Urshifu is still a good deck, but it does have polarizing matchups. Snorlax Stall is another deck with polarizing matchups. We could see more players come back to this deck with its recent success, and an auto-win Zard Pidgeot winning San Antonio. High HP Pokemon seem to be thriving right now. Zardy-X, Tina V-Star, Palkia V-Star, and Ice Rider VMAX, Mew VMAX, Rapid Strike Urshifu and Inteleon, even Maridon with Charms. A logical answer to this is Moon or Tina since they OHKO instantly, but Moon's issue is its self-damage. Tina will likely stay one of the top decks because it doesn't have any direct counters. Lost Zone Box with type-specific counters and Tina and or Moon for OHKOs is in a good spot, but it suffers from consistency issues and needing a high-precision pilot. Chi and Pal is very good at OHKOs and is favorable into Charizard. It could see a resurgence. As for Gardevoir, I didn't mention anything specific about Gardevoir, but it seems to be leaning down towards the tier 2 range right now. It doesn't have incredible matchups. It does have some bad matchups, but it's a very, very strong deck that takes a lot of effort to play well, and even then nothing is guaranteed. So because it doesn't have as great of a matchup spread like it did going into LAIC, now more people are prepared for Gardevoir, and the metagame has developed around Gardevoir a little bit more. It's not as dominant as I would have said it was going into LAIC. So this is Nick Robinson's top 8 deck list for Maridon from San Antonio. I like the way this is built. I think it makes sense moving forward. This is Dan Hugar's Giratina list. This is something closer to what I would have played if I had went to San Antonio, specifically because I like the Spiritomb for reasons mentioned previously. This is Jake Gearhart's Gardevoir deck list. So he placed 100th with it. But he also had somebody else play the same exact deck list that got 106. So like 2 people with the same 60-card deck list making day 2, top 100 out of almost 2,000 players. Not too bad. Jake says that Deoxys V-Star makes the Maridon matchup slightly favored and makes Rapid Strike favored as long as you don't get looped off the board turn 2, because Deoxys V-Star can one-hit KO Iron Hands EX for 1 energy and Inteleon VMAX for 6 energies. Also, just to note, it's funny that Jake played Gardevoir after saying it would be dead in this format. And this is the super effective glasses build of Lost Zone Box with a whole bunch of stuff going on in Zero Sableye. I talked about this one more in my San Antonio deck lists review, which should be the video that came out either 1 or 2 days prior to this video. And yeah, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, please check out my affiliates and sponsors down below, and subscribe to the channel for more Pokemon TCG content. I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.